Of all the famous coders on the C64, Jeffminter may well be the most iconic of them all. Renowned for his psychedelic take on arcade classics just as much as his love for ruminant livestock, Jeff has been coding games for nearly 40 years, with arguably his most well-known creations appearing on the Commodore in the early 80s. Jeff was an early adopter of the C64, and armed with coding skills learned in the VIC-20 and the Sinclair machines, he set out to work turning out his vision of gaming on this new machine. Jeff's first game on the Commodore, Rock 64, is a pretty simple affair. What starts off looking like it's going to be a lunar lander type game turns out to be a fairly basic missile command clone instead. Your little lunar module drifts down to the surface of the planet, and you must fire off missiles to destroy the incoming objects before they destroy the ground you're on. Jeff was an early adopter of the C64 in the UK, and this is a very early game from these shores. That said, the presentation is really nice, especially as it's programmed in BASIC rather than machine code. This was a very modest release, and one Jeff doesn't really think of as a mainstream part of his work, but it hints at what is to come. A sci-fi take on the arcade classic Centipede, Gridrunner was an early game for both Llamasoft and the C64. Like in Centipede, your aim is to destroy the dots that wind their way down from the screen from side to side, while also dealing with objects that come heading your way. The main difference is in the random nature of the enemy guns that track around the edges of the screen, which either shoot at you or fire an electric beam right across the screen at regular intervals. Having to keep your eye on multiple different things at once gives a more hectic game than the one that inspired it. Thankfully, you don't have to shove coins in this one to have another go. Definitely still worth having a shot at today. Arguably Llamasoft's most iconic game, Attack of the Mutant Camels is the forebear of all the animal-related madness of Jeff's games. Unashamedly based on the Atari 2600 version of The Empire Strikes Back, you pilot a spaceship fighting off not AT-ATs, but giant dromedaries, intent on rampaging across the land and smashing your base up. While the graphics show their age now, there's some really nice effects to be enjoyed from explosions and flashing borders when ships are destroyed, along with a simple radar that shows you how close the camels are to the end. The sound too is another thing done well here, and is a common highlight across Llamasoft games, recalling the minimal but effective sound design from the golden age of arcades. The game is fairly simple, especially once you figure out the pattern of the camels' attacks and how to control your ship when you turn, but there's quite a bit of fun to be had here going for high scores. A game I hadn't come across before making this video, Laserzone has become a real favourite of mine. These days I'm a real fan of quick and simple arcade style action, and that's exactly what we get here. You control two laser turrets defending against incoming enemies. They slide and fire along two axes, but they can also be angled to take out enemies that have landed near your partnering laser. This sounds handy, but it's also possible to destroy your own lasers this way if you aren't careful where you're aiming. The safer way to take out aliens that are threatening your turrets is by using a limited number of smart bombs available to you, by pressing the Commodore key. Each stage gets a little harder, and more complex enemies occasionally appear to fire back at you. A really simple and fun game that wouldn't have looked out of place in the arcade, only occasionally let down by some dodgy hit detection. Yet more Centipede-style action, Matrix is a sequel to Gridrunner. Upping the ante in almost every aspect of the game, Matrix runs faster, has more enemies, scrolling backgrounds, just more everything. With this increase in speed and game elements, it might be more difficult to get into this than its prequel. But this frantic style of gaming is a hallmark of Llamasoft. Jeff has stated that he has purposely done this to overwhelm the player in many of his games, and there's plenty more of that to come as we move through his back catalogue. Get to grips with Gridrunner first before you tackle this one. Of course, Llamasoft in the C64 these days is most well known for weirdness and psychedelica. Ancipital delivers both of these things in spades. You control a humanoid goat who has to traverse a maze of rooms, with each having 4-way gravity walls. This is something that is easier to show than explain. Each room has a unique name and theme, often with bizarre enemies coming at you, including cigarettes, floppy disks, and of course, animals. Your projectiles even change with each room, and sometimes they behave in a totally unexpected way. This is one of the easier games to get into here, as the difficulty is reasonable enough at the start. The main difficulty is in learning how the gravity works and figuring out how to move from each side or platform without losing a life. One to show your friends when you tell them that the old games are sometimes the most out there. They certainly don't make them like this anymore. On the surface, this might seem like a straight sequel to Laserzone. You control laser turrets sliding along opposing axes, but the pacing is completely different from its prequel. There's however plenty of hell playing through this, with perhaps being the peak of Jeff's strategy to overwhelm the player. almost entirely impossible to get to grips with, it feels like what could be a relatively easy game to pick up and play, but the swarms of enemies quickly become unmanageable as they descend onto your turrets. There isn't much footage of this one out there, so it's hard to tell if anyone has really mastered it. Maybe you could step up to the challenge to get a long play of this. For me, it's a very interesting concept, but it could have done with a couple of slower screens to ease you into it, as it is nigh on impenetrable. For a developer that had so much invested in animals that ate grass, maybe it's a surprise that one of his most well-known games is about a machine that cuts it. The 8-bit machines had no shortage of games that had you simulating jobs, even those of the mediocre and menial kind, but with a little twist of British humour. Hovver Bovver sees you borrowing, in the loosest sense of the term, your neighbour's lawnmowers to mow on your client's lawns. Sounds simple enough, doesn't it? But you have to avoid your neighbour chasing after you to get his mower back, while skillfully making your way around the grassy bits of the gardens and avoiding cutting up the flower beds. You have a mostly trusty dog that helps you chase off your pursuers when you press fire, but will only do your bidding for so long before they end up getting in your way. Your clients will also come out and chase you if you damage any of the flowers, so it pays to be precise, otherwise you'll make things twice as difficult for yourself. This is surprisingly still good fun today, with for once a more gradual increase in difficulty. It also stands out that it's really the only game here that isn't a variation of a space shooter. Yes, it really is called Metagalactic Llamas Battle at the Edge of Time. Don't be put off, however, by what might be the strangest ever name for a game. What we have here is a clever little arcade style game. Unusually, while it was designed by Jeff, the actual programming was done by Aaron Littleman. You control a llama that can fire laser beams from its eyes to take out spiders that descend from the top of the screen. They are easier to take care of as they fall. Once they hit the ground, disposing of them becomes much harder. The standout game mechanic here is a force field that you can raise and lower to angle your shots. This makes it a bit different than many other single screen shooters, although the slow speed of your llama makes the difficulty level a bit steep. Still, it's definitely one to try out if you like early 80s single screen style shooters. We're heading into truly bonkers territory here. Revenge of the Mutant Camels sees everyone's favourite dromedaries return. This time, you are in control of them as they try to reclaim their home planet from a strange mix of stolen arcade characters and British in-jokes. Red telephone boxes, Pac-Man, literally raining cats and dogs, it's all here for you to shoot through. This will raise a smile for those of you pining for the 80s with some of the references, but of course, is the game any good? Well, it's a logical progression from Attack of the Mutant Camels, and it is worth a go today, though it likely won't have you playing for hours on end. Jeff has released a fixed version of this recently, improving the hit detection, and I think it does make a noticeable difference. I was able to get a bit further than the standard version. Another reimagining of an arcade game here. This time Defender gets the Llamasoft treatment. You control a sheep that can fly through space and can shoot what looks like bony old dog biscuits at enemy ships. So far, so Llamasoft. Unlike Defender, there are no humans to rescue here. You simply hunt down the enemies to stop them blowing up your planet. You also have to land your sheep on patches of grass to keep them fed so they can keep going. Don't let them overgraze or they'll die, presumably from bursting. Now, I'm fond of Defender, but I'm not so keen on this one. Your shots arc with the gravity of the top and bottom fields, and your speed is also affected by how close you fly to them, making placing shots accurately feel more difficult than it should. You could get to grips with this with a lot of practice, but will you find that it's worth it? Not one that I enjoy, I'm afraid. As we move through the Llamasoft library, we get to a few games that don't stick strictly to the straight-up shooter formula. While some see Jeff attempting to overwhelm the player with the amount of things going on the screen, or needing to keep track of meters, Batalyx sees you playing through multiple mini-games, and completing each one makes the remaining ones harder. Each one is like a Llamasoft game in miniature, and the shooters are quite simple to pick up and play. What is harder to pick up is a reaction game on the Llama trick, and the game with the balls moving around the sliding floor. If you were a newcomer to Llamasoft, this is probably the game to try out and experience what the rest of the library is going to be like. Going over the intricacies of all the games here is a bit out of the scope of this video, so time to go grab some instructions or check out the annotated long play video I've linked here, once you've watched the rest of this of course. A divisive one on the internet next. This is the point many fans thought that Jeff had gone too far with the madness. Mama Llama sees you defending a group of llamas through 100 stages with a swirling droid. It was a brave and innovative decision to remove the blasting entirely from this game, leaving you to collide with the enemies to defend your llamas, but it might also be the biggest turn-off for many fans. The droid itself is very difficult to control, and the enemies are so quick and often very deadly, making most levels nearly impossible. Add to this the confusing level selection and difficulty sliders leaves the player too often in the realms of total frustration. Often this was Jeff's plan to challenge the player, but unfortunately this time it all went too far. This is one of those times where a game has a nice underlying idea, but lacks the refinements of execution to make it actually enjoyable. As usual, there are unusual enemies and backgrounds throughout the levels, but you're unlikely to give this more than one go just to see the evolution of the Llamasoft games. After the ambition of Mama Llama failed to make the impact that Jeff intended, you might have expected him to pare things back a bit and go right back to basics for the next game. Not so with Iridis Alpha. What we have here is another complicated shooter that harks back to Defender in the same way as Sheep in Space. Both a refinement and expansion of that vision, Iridis Alpha sees you scooting around blasting aliens while scrolling left and right. You have complicated resources to manage, both losing too much energy to enemy hits and gaining too much from successful attacks will destroy your ship. There's also a separate lower playfield that needs to be managed if you want to progress far in the game. You must access this before the ship on the other side atrophies too much. All the mechanics are very complicated, but this is the way the game was intended to be. It is actually much more fun to play than it sounds. You can get into the zone with this one and want to have one more go to climb the high score table. Deserving of more love than it gets these days, I'd rather watch skilled players go through this than many of the bullet hell playthroughs that are out there, as it's a true test of dexterity, reactions and decisions, and not just memorising patterns. More centipede inspired action here. Voidrunner is the final interpretation from Llamasoft of the classic game on the C64. Not massively dissimilar to Gridrunner or Matrix, you still fly around a single screen shooting enemies that track in from above and need to avoid the pulsing lines crossing the play area. What does differ is you control a group of ships that change formation between levels. You can end up firing in different directions, mirrored patterns or just straightforward lines. The visuals are a bit busy and there's plenty of psychedelic messages in huge letters between the levels. While this isn't the hardest to get to grips with, you might find the purposely garish visuals a bit too much. Certainly worth a go for all the Minter-esque presentation, but I do prefer Gridrunner to this one. And finally we have the last of the Camel games. Return of the Mutant Camels was the last release on the C64 for Llamasoft, and Jeff showed that he had learned from the mistakes he'd made with Mama Llama in trying to make a game overly ambitious. There is a slightly confusing level select screen here, as there was in that game, but the initial levels are much more forgiving. Gone too is the awkward attack mechanism, replaced with what is the closest we've had to a machine gun toting camel. Back again are the bizarre enemies, underpants, telephones, floppy disks, borrowed characters from other arcade games and all the other usual Llamasoft paraphernalia. You can also drop miniature camels as bombs that run along the screen if you jump and fire down. Each level is thankfully quite short, allowing you to progress quickly through the madness, as often seeing what the next enemy is going to be is half the fun in these games. The refinement of the earlier games pays off here, with good hit detection and pacing throughout. Definitely still worth playing today, even if it does get a bit repetitive. Jeff still works in the games industry today, and of course still has his trademark line of psychedelic visuals going on in his titles. Tempest is a game Jeff has made many different versions of. Unfortunately the C64 never managed to see a Llamasoft version. And if you have a VR set, Polybius is another game to check out. Of course, after watching these games you probably want to play them, and you can do so for free at the moment, either by picking up the ROMs from the Llamasoft homepage, or on Antstream, where you could challenge me to beat your high scores. Maybe I'll see you in the high score tables over there. Happy blasting!